My name is Preventative. I'm in 11th grade at the Foxcroft School, and what we're going to be presenting today is a continuation and expansion of the research that I was doing at a research undergraduate program at Arizona State University this summer. So I'm basically talking about Zika today. And just to give you a little background, Zika was first identified in rhesus monkeys in Uganda in 1947, and then it was identified in humans a few years later in 1952. It's spread by the Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, and these mosquitoes also spread chikungunya and dengue. So when we were looking at how to start modeling the Zika virus, we looked at models used for chikungunya and dengue, because we were looking at similarities. So two major concerns about this virus are the Guillain-Barré syndrome, because it can result in paraplegia in severe cases, as well as the risk of microcephaly if a pregnant mother contracts the disease. So how do we solve these major world problems? We look at mathematical models. And so, looking at two people, Kermack and McKendrick, in 1927, they discovered something called the SIR model, and this is basically a deterministic compartmental model with differential equations. And so, as you can see, it has three phases: SIR, which is the susceptible, the infected, and the recovered classes. And so, we use these models to describe how a disease behaves and how the dynamics are. So when we look at different diseases, we can modify and enhance these models. So when we look at sexually transmitted diseases like chlamydia and syphilis, gonorrhea, we look at SIS models, which we look at how the members of the population move from the susceptible phase to the infected phase and then back to the susceptible phase without recovering. Similarly, we can add in phases, like you see the SEIR phase, model, which we have the exposed phase, and that basically describes an incubation period that can occur when the virus is in the human's body. And these are models, the SEIR models are used to describe diseases like chikungunya and dengue, so that's where we started. Another thing I'd just like to point out before we move on is Kermack and McKendrick also created one. They discovered one really important mathematical value called the basic reproductive number, and this value can basically tell us whether or not the epidemic will exist. So if the R naught value is less than 1, then it will cease to exist, but if R naught is greater than 1, then the epidemic will thrive, which we obviously don't want. So going deeper into Zika, a lot of current models look similar to this flowchart. As you can see, there's SEIR for describing the humans, and then the SEI describing the mosquito populations. So we start out with the uninfected mosquito, and so once this mosquito bites an infected host, the virus starts to replicate within the mosquito's body, and that's why we have the exposed phase denoted by E sub V. And so that basically is describing the incubation period that the mosquito goes through before it turns into an officially infected mosquito. So once it's infected, we see that there's the vector interaction to the human. So the infected mosquito bites the uninfected host, and then a similar process occurs where we have the disease replicating in the human's body, and then they go through the same process where we have the exposed phase and then the infected phase. But unlike the mosquitoes, they actually recover. So some things that we're looking at are both direct and sexual transmission. So as we know, Zika is transmitted through vector-human interaction, but it's also transmitted through human-human interaction. So it can be transmitted from males to females and females to males. And we also looked at expanding the compartments in our model. So instead of just having an infectious phase, we have two infectious phases now that are describing a symptomatic infectious and asymptomatic infectious. in which we can see whether or not the human host will have signs or symptoms of the disease. So, and then finally we're talking about in the preventive measures, which are the ITN and the IRS, which ITN stands for insecticide-treated bed nets, and IRS stands for indoor residual spraying. And these two preventive measures basically help to reduce the mosquito population and prevent human-mosquito interaction, which can in turn help to reduce the number of cases of Zika. And then the last thing that I'm going to talk about is basically looking at how Zika might spread during large celebratory events, for example, the Olympics that just happened. So in one model, we were looking at, as I said before, the two classes of infections, and then direct and sexual contact, as well as we have a disease death term for our vectors. And we didn't consider the death term for the humans. So this is the first model that I'm talking about today. So as you can see from the directly down from SH to EH, we have a term that's describing the sexual transmission. So from the susceptible human, we move to the exposed human. And then the exposed human now has two different choices. There's a proportion Q that kind of describes whether or not the human will move into the symptomatic or the asymptomatic phases. So that's why we have the IHA and IHS. And from there, they move on with the recovery rates respective to the symptomatic or asymptomatic classes into the recovered phase. So we also see this long diagonal arrow pointing from IM to SH. That's describing the human-vector interaction between the infected mosquito to the susceptible human. And here you see this term VMH, and that's basically made up of a transmission rate between from the mosquito to the human and the biting rate of the mosquito. So next we're going to look at how we can include the preventive measures. And so, as I said before, the ITN and the IRS are the preventive measures that we're looking at. And so this is how we were able to kind of put them into our model. So as you can see here, we have the kind of the negative term with the mosquitoes, because that's how we can see that the mosquitoes are actually dying and the population is reducing because of those preventive measures. So you see the downward arrows pointing from each of the phases of the mosquito diagram. And we also see the 1 minus ITN term in the SH and the EH equations. That's another similar thing that's just describing how the ITN is affecting the populations. So the ITN and the IRS both range from 0 to 1. And so what we did is now we look at the basic reproductive number. And this, as I said before, can tell us whether or not our disease can exist. So it's basically the number of secondary infections that will occur when we have like one infected person walking into a full room of susceptible people. So what we did is we looked at the new infections that were coming directly into our exposed phase, which are described by this vector here, F. And then we were looking at the outflow from those infections, which we see in V. So we were able to calculate the Jacobian matrix of the F vector. And then this is the result that we got. And similarly, we were able to look at the Jacobian matrix for V. And these are all with respect to the new infection phases, so the exposed humans, exposed mosquitoes, asymptomatic infectious humans, symptomatic humans, and then the infected mosquitoes. So finally, we were able to look at what our next generation matrix was in order to find the R0 value. And so that was basically, so the R0 is basically the spectral radius of the next generation matrix. So we were able to do a lot of calculations and then come to this, this expression. So we can see here that it's actually like a very complicated, but it's like a modified version of like a sum of the R naught values, which would be for the asymptomatic and the symptomatic. So, and then we were looking at these specific parameters that we were using to try and look at numerical solutions for to find like a value for R naught to see whether or not it was less than 1. So this is one of the simulations that we were looking at, and this basically, this was done in MATLAB, and so this basically shows we have our ITN and IRS on our X and Y axes, and then we see that both of them range from 0 to 1. And so we were looking at how as we vary the parameters for these values, we could see where specifically the R naught value would be less than 1. So that would be like the most useful. And then this is another thing that we ran, and so we could basically see what would happen if we set the ITN and IRS values at 0.5. So this is another thing that we did. We were looking at how Zika would change as it's spreading across through celebratory events, such as the Olympics. And so here what we did differently was that we considered 3 populations, which we had a visitor population in Rio, going to Rio. We had a native population of Rio, and then we had a population of sex workers in Rio. So again, we're looking at both sexual and direct contact, and we're also looking at the disease death rate for the vectors, but not for the humans. So this was the model that we had for the humans, and as you can see, the sigma term helps us to describe the fact that we can interact with all 3 populations and not just one population anymore. And most of the other terms are almost the same because it's the same interactions between the vectors and the humans. So we see the AHJ term above, and that's basically describing the preferred mixing term that we were able to incorporate. And so basically based on the proportion F sub H, we were able to say that there would be a proportion of people who would mix within their own groups, and then a proportion of people who would mix specifically with the other groups. So if we had said that with H being 1, 2, and 3, F1, F2, F3, if they were all equal to 0, then we'd have specifically a proportionate mixing. So then we're looking at the vector model, and similar to before, we still have the SEI, but now one of the only differences is that we have the sigma term, which lets us know that the mosquitoes can get infected by all 3 of the populations. And we also have the disease death term that's in the bottom. So we went through a similar process, but this time when we were looking at the basic reproductive number, we had no sexual contact to make it a little easier. So we went through the same thing, and we have our Jacobian F, Jacobian V, and then we have the R naught squared value here. And so here it's much clearer. We see that it's like a direct sum of the symptomatic R naught and the asymptomatic R naught. And so, like before, we have our parameters that we're using currently to find numerical solutions to these values. And then this is one of the simulations that we were able to run using MATLAB again. So I'd just like to conclude. So we were able to find many different enhanced mathematical models describing both direct and sexual contact with the disease death rate, and incorporating both symptomatic and asymptomatic infectious classes. Although it wasn't presented in this presentation, we are also working on our final size relation, and we're able to derive it analytically. And we're working on like validating our model numerically in MATLAB. So yeah, any questions?
We had a lot of